January 1943, Tunisia. Erwin Rommel stood over a table of maps with the kind of quiet focus that meant trouble for everyone on the other side. This wasn't a speech. This wasn't a rally. It was the cold math of survival. He had limited German strength left in North Africa. The Allies were tightening the noose from two directions. From the east came the British 8th Army, seasoned and organized. From the west came fresh American forces, moving in after the landings of Operation Torch. Rommel's decision showed exactly who he feared most. He placed battle-tested German units opposite the British. The 21st Panzer Division, veterans of desert fighting, was held where it could meet British armor and blunt British pressure. Other elite German formations were positioned to face the British line as well, because Rommel believed that front would decide whether the Axis could keep breathing another month. But opposite the Americans, Rommel accepted risk. He leaned more heavily on Italian divisions, units that were often short on modern equipment, short on mobility, and worn down after years of war. On paper, that looked like an insult to an ally and a gamble against a rising power. In reality, it was a message. The British required Germany's best. The Americans at that moment could be managed with less. If you want more W-Fund stories that cut through the myths and get to what commanders actually did, hit subscribe and keep the bell on. You won't want to miss what comes next. To understand why Rommel made that call, you have to understand what he had learned since he first arrived in North Africa in early 1941. He didn't build his opinion of the British from rumors. He built it from hard experience, ambushes, counterattacks, and long campaigns where victories didn't end the fight. The British did not fight like the armies Germany had smashed in 1939 and 1940. They didn't fall apart just because the situation got messy. When Rommel flanked positions, British units often did not panic. When a line became unsafe, they didn't always die in place either. They pulled back in an organized way, set up again, and made the Germans fight for every new mile. That pattern drove German commanders crazy because it denied them the clean, decisive endings they preferred. Beat the British in one spot, and you still hadn't finished them. The next day or the next week, they were back in a new position, still in the campaign, still dangerous. Rommel also respected how fast the British learned in the desert. By 1941, British and Commonwealth troops had already been fighting in North Africa for months. That mattered. Desert war was its own brutal subject. It broke vehicles. It punished mistakes. It turned small problems, like navigation, water, and dust, into life-or-death issues. Experienced desert armies learned lessons that green units had to learn the hard way. They learned how quickly engines died in sand and how much maintenance it took to keep armor moving. They learned what heat did to men and machines. They learned that attacking at the wrong time of day could burn out troops before they ever reached the enemy. They learned the ground, where you could move fast, where you bogged down, and where a safe route could become a trap. And most importantly, by 1941 and 1942, many British units had learned how to fight Germans in the desert. They became less impressed by speed and more focused on denying it. They avoided being neatly surrounded. They withdrew before a trap closed, then hit back from angles the Germans didn't like. The British had weaknesses too. Their armor wasn't always used in the most concentrated way early on. Coordination between tanks, infantry, and artillery could be uneven. British tanks were often outclassed by German panzers in certain matchups, especially before later improvements arrived. But here's the key. Those weaknesses did not mean the British were pushovers. They were disciplined, stubborn, and hard to knock out of the fight for good. Nothing proved this stubbornness more than Tobruk. In 1941, Axis forces surrounded the port and expected it to fold. Instead, it held out for months. The defenders endured constant pressure and harsh conditions, and yet the position stayed alive far longer than German planners wanted. Tobruk became a warning sign to anyone who thought the British would always break when cut off. That kind of resistance taught Rommel a simple rule. Even when the British lost ground, they didn't necessarily lose the campaign. Over time, German forces in North Africa developed a grudging respect for what the British had built. An ability to absorb punishment without their whole structure collapsing. Lose a position, keep the army. Lose a fight, keep the front. take casualties, keep operating. That wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. So by 1943, in Rommel's mind, the British were not just an enemy, they were a known quantity, experienced, methodical, and relentless when they had the advantage. If you gave them an opening, they could exploit it steadily, and they could keep coming. Now bring in the Americans. The Americans arrived with huge potential. Their industrial power meant strong supply, plenty of vehicles, and the ability to replace losses in a way the Axis could not. Their artillery and air support could be overwhelming when coordinated well, and their manpower meant the Allies could keep building pressure. But potential is not the same as combat experience. In early 1943, many American units in North Africa were still learning what a veteran enemy looked like. They were learning the desert. They were learning what happens when plans collide with dust, broken radios, and supply lines stretched across rough country. They were learning how quickly a fast-moving armored fight can turn into chaos if command and control isn't tight. Rommel understood learning curves because he'd watched the British climb one. He knew that in war, green forces can be dangerous, but they also make mistakes that veterans know how to punish. That is why his map in January 1943 looked the way it did. He didn't allocate forces based on pride. He allocated them based on threat, timing, and what his enemies had already proven they could do. Britain had proven itself in the desert for 2 long years. America was just stepping into the classroom. And the next test, coming fast through the Tunisian passes, would show the entire world what happens when raw power meets seasoned experience for the first time. When American troops landed in North Africa in November 1942, they arrived with everything an army wants on paper: new equipment, big numbers, massive supply behind them, a reputation built on training and confidence. But Rommel wasn't judging paper. He was judging what happens when shells start landing, radios go dead in sand, and a unit has to make decisions in seconds with incomplete information. German intelligence looked at the Americans and saw a dangerous future problem, but not always an immediate one. The United States had the industry to replace losses fast. American artillery could be heavy and accurate when directed well. American air power could be crushing when it showed up at the right time and place. Still, in early 1943, many American formations were fighting their first real battles against a veteran enemy in harsh terrain. That mattered more than people wanted to admit later. Rommel's clearest read on American readiness came from what German units reported during the fighting in Tunisia, especially around the mountain passes where the terrain forced armies into narrow corridors. In that kind of country, experience shows instantly. Veteran troops don't just fight hard, they keep their shape. They fall back in order when they have to. They protect their flanks. They keep command moving even when pressure hits. They don't let panic spread like fire. In the early clashes against German armor and infantry, some American units did fight bravely. There were pockets that held on. There were crews that stayed with their guns. But overall, the Germans saw signs of an army that hadn't been through this kind of storm yet. Instead of controlled withdrawal, parts of the American line sometimes came apart. When pressure hit, some positions were abandoned too quickly. Vehicles and guns were left behind in ways veteran forces tried hard to avoid. Confusion in command made it worse because hesitation and mixed orders are exactly what experienced attackers look for. German panzer and infantry formations that had spent 2 years trading blows with the British could feel the difference. Against the British, German attacks usually met organized resistance, then a deliberate pullback, then another firm line. Against the Americans early on, the Germans sometimes met sharp fire, followed by a sudden loss of cohesion once the situation shifted. It wasn't that American soldiers were cowards. That wasn't the lesson. The lesson was that experience builds habits under stress, and the Americans had not built those habits yet. The desert also punished them. American units were learning in real time how far a supply line could stretch before it started snapping. They were learning how sand clogged engines, how heat wore down men, and how quickly a plan broke when maintenance and fuel didn't keep up. They were learning what veteran British units had already learned the hard way. In North Africa, logistics wasn't a support detail, it was the fight. And then there was doctrine. Many American officers had been trained in aggressive movement and bold action In peacetime training, that looks great. In battle, it can become predictable if the enemy has already studied how to punish it. In early 1943, German commanders saw American attacks that were sometimes too direct and not always well coordinated between armor, infantry, and artillery. The British, by contrast, had already learned painful lessons about what not to do against German tanks and anti-tank guns. British commanders had learned to be cautious in the right moments and stubborn in the moments that mattered. They were not perfect, but they were battle-shaped. That difference in experience is what sat behind Rommel's deployment choices. He didn't believe the British could be handled. He believed they could grind him down. The Eighth Army had a reputation for being methodical. When it had the tools, it could apply steady pressure, bring artillery to bear, and keep attacking in a way that slowly crushed defenses. Even when the British made mistakes, they tended to recover in an organized way. Even when they lost ground, they did not tend to lose the campaign. So Rommel put his scarce, reliable German formations where that pressure would land. The Americans, coming in from the west, were a different kind of threat. Their long-term danger was enormous, but in early 1943, the Germans believed American inexperience could be exploited for time. Time was everything for Rommel. He needed time because Axis strength in North Africa was limited and shrinking. He needed time because fuel, replacements, and air cover were never enough. He needed time because the Allies could bring more men and more machines, while Germany could not. That is where the Italian units entered the story. By 1943, many Italian divisions in North Africa were struggling. They often lacked modern tanks, adequate transport, and consistent supply. Morale had been worn down by losses, harsh conditions, and the sense that they were fighting a war they could not truly control. Some Italian units fought hard when well led and supported, but the overall force was not in the condition Rommel wanted opposite the British. Rommel's experience told him a simple truth. Against the British, weak and tired units could collapse fast. So he did what commanders do when the situation is bad and resources are limited. He made a priority list. He placed his strongest, most dependable German troops to face the British line, and he accepted more risk on the American side by leaving more of that front to Italian formations and second-line strength. That choice carried an insult, whether Rommel meant it politely or not. To Allied commanders, it looked like the Germans were taking the Americans less seriously. For Americans on the ground, it could feel like being told they hadn't earned a seat at the grown-ups table yet. And that stung, especially for leaders who were confident the U.S. Army would become first-rate once it had real combat seasoning. But Rommel wasn't thinking about pride. He was thinking about what happens tomorrow morning when British guns open up and British armor moves with practiced timing. He had fought the British long enough to know that if he guessed wrong on that front, the whole defense could crack. And as winter turned into early spring, the war in Tunisia moved toward a set of battles that would test Rommel's logic in public, under fire. On one side, British forces were preparing with the patience of veterans. On the other side, American forces were absorbing brutal lessons at high speed. The next phase would show what happens when Rommel's best units hit a prepared British defense, and what happens when the Americans, angry and learning, start changing faster than the Germans expected. By March 1943, Rommel's deployment logic was no longer just a theory on a map. It was about to be tested in the most unforgiving way possible, under British guns, in open desert approaches with no room for excuses. Rommel attempted a spoiling blow against the British near Medellin. The idea was straightforward in concept. Hit first, disrupt British timing, and force the Eighth Army to react instead of launching its own planned offensive. It was a familiar kind of move for him, fast, sharp, meant to steal initiative. But this time, he wasn't facing a confused enemy still learning the desert. He was facing an army that had been fighting here since 1940, an army that had seen his tricks, studied his patterns, and built a methodical machine designed to punish German armor. British preparations mattered. The British didn't simply wait in a line and hope. They dug in their anti-tank guns, disguised positions, planned fire lanes, and coordinated artillery so that likely approach routes could be smashed quickly. When the Germans rolled forward, they were not charging into surprise. They were driving into a carefully built killing zone. And this is the part that makes Rommel's earlier decision so important. He had placed elite German units on this front because only elite units could even attempt this kind of attack against the British. Even then, the attack struggled. German tanks moved under fire that arrived quickly and accurately. Anti-tank guns hit at ranges where German crews could not easily answer back. British artillery landed where it needed to land, cutting up formations and forcing commanders to pull back before losses became catastrophic. The result was exactly the kind of outcome Rommel had learned to expect when fighting the British. Even when the Germans tried to seize the initiative, the British were prepared to absorb the blow and make the attacker pay for it. This wasn't the kind of enemy that collapsed just because someone attacked hard. It was the kind of enemy that defended with patience, then kept applying pressure until the defender ran out of strength. While that was happening on the British side, the situation opposite the Americans revealed the other half of Rommel's calculation. The Americans were still learning the hard lessons of combat, and early on, that learning often showed up as caution. American units probed, advanced, and sometimes pulled back when they met serious resistance. They frequently wanted better conditions before committing fully. They preferred overwhelming advantage before taking heavy risks. That approach can be smart at times, but in this campaign against defenders who needed to be shoved off key ground, excessive caution could slow progress. Veteran forces like the British had learned a painful truth. Sometimes you take a position because it must be taken, even if it costs you. Waiting for perfect conditions can mean never attacking at all. Operational success often requires calculated risk. In early 1943, many American commanders were still wrestling with that reality, not because they were weak, but because they were new to fighting a skilled enemy who punished hesitation as much as recklessness. And then there was the psychological piece, the insult hidden in Rommel's deployments. American commanders could read a map. They understood what it meant if German elite units were set against the British, while Italian divisions took the brunt against American advances. It suggested the Germans saw the British as the immediate serious danger and the Americans as the developing threat that could be delayed. That message hit American pride hard. General George S. Patton, who would later become one of the most aggressive and famous American commanders of the war, understood the implication. If the Germans thought the Americans deserved to fight Italy's weaker units, Patton took that personally. He saw it as a statement that the U.S. Army was not yet considered first team. Whether Rommel meant it as contempt or not, it landed as an insult. But what made Rommel's decision both sharp and limited was this. It was correct at the tactical moment, yet dangerous in the bigger picture, because the Americans were learning fast. German reports from the Tunisia campaign show an evolution over time. Early assessments emphasized American inexperience, attacks that were too direct, poor reaction to sudden pressure, and uneven coordination. But as weeks passed, German commanders began noticing changes. American artillery fire grew more effective as observers and batteries got better at working together. American air power, when coordinated, became a major problem. American logistics, once it found its rhythm, could support operations with a weight the Axis could not match. And American infantry began fighting with more determination and better discipline as commanders adjusted tactics and units gained real confidence. The gap that Rommel had exploited early started closing quickly. That is the part many post-war narratives prefer to smooth over. Not because it makes anyone look bad, but because it shows something deeply human about armies. They perform like who they are at the time. In early 1943, British forces in North Africa were veterans. American forces were not yet. Later, American forces would become hardened and skilled through campaigns in Sicily, Italy, France, and into Germany. But in Tunisia, early on, the difference was real. Rommel's own behavior reflected that belief in dozens of small, practical ways. German attention and resources leaned toward the British sector because that was where he expected the most competent pressure. Reconnaissance focused heavily on British positions. Artillery planning prioritized British assembly areas. Counterattacks were designed first around British penetrations. None of that was about propaganda. It was about survival. The Italians, meanwhile, were caught in a grim middle position. They often resented being used as a kind of shield, especially when it felt like the Germans were saving their best troops for the real fight against the British. Italian commanders knew the Germans didn't fully trust them, and being placed opposite the Americans could feel like either mercy or insult, depending on how you looked at it. In the end, it didn't save anyone. The final collapse in Tunisia in May 1943 showed the larger reality Rommel could not escape. The British, pressing from the east with experience, artillery, armor, and steady operational pressure, kept grinding the Axis down. The Americans, pressing from the west, broke through Italian positions with increasing effectiveness and pushed forward as they gained confidence and competence. Together, the two Allied thrusts created an operational vice that the Axis simply did not have the resources to stop. Rommel's original allocation, best against the British, weaker forces against the Americans, had been a rational response to scarcity in early 1943, but it became obsolete quickly as the Americans improved faster than the Germans expected and as the Allied material advantage grew heavier by the week. That's the ultimate irony of the whole decision. Rommel read the moment correctly, but the moment changed. Tunisia fell, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered, and after the war, the uncomfortable truth faded into easier storytelling. The Allies were always equal, always perfectly unified, always equally prepared. Reality was messier. The British in North Africa had earned German respect through 2 years of hard fighting and adaptation. The Americans were in the process of earning theirs, faster than anyone predicted, but not instantly. In early 1943, the maps told a blunt story about combat experience and threat assessment. Rommel feared the British more right then, because they had already proven what they could do. He gambled that the Americans could be delayed with weaker troops long enough to keep the front alive. It didn't work because the Allies had too much power and too much momentum, but the deployment maps remain, and they don't flatter anyone's pride. They simply record what a battlefield commander believed at a specific moment when he had to choose where his best soldiers would stand. Rommel's best faced the British. His worst faced the Americans, and in that decision, written in orders confirmed by results, you can see how experience, resilience, and learning curves shaped the real war in Tunisia, far away from the clean myths that came later.